Hi, today I will be talking about historical fantasy. Historical fantasy is of course a subgenre of fantasy. It is sometimes often known as the sword and sorcery genre. Fantasy itself is alternative realities based on imagined fantastical elements such as magic or supernatural phenomena. So, historical fantasy is when you take that supernatural or magical elements and place them in a historical setting. Therefore, your story can take place in the 1800s or the 1700s in a real life location, and you have added creatures or magic into it that wouldn't necessarily be there. The history of historical fantasy is definitely deeply rooted in a lot of mythologies and then, of course, history. So here we have some examples of some genres which tie over with historical fantasy. Arabian fantasy, which the best example is 1001 Nights or Arabian Nights. Celtic fantasy, which is historical fantasy and Celtic historical fiction. Classical fantasy, which is Greek and Roman myths. Steampunk, which is steam technology mixed with Victorian or Gothic architecture and technology. Gunpowder punk, which is very similar to steampunk, the difference between the two being that gunpowder punk uses the technology of the time and it mixes them with magic mythical creatures such as elves, unicorns, gods. So you would have someone in the 1700s with their musket or their sword fighting a unicorn or something similar to that. And then finally we have medieval fantasy, which includes elements of the Middle Ages in Europe, their culture and their society such as government and medieval warfare, and it mixes them with mythology of European folklore. Here we have some images that really tie together the historical fantasy with these subgenres. The Fisherman and the Genie by Arthur Rickham is an image from 1001 Nights. And here we have a regular historical figure with a creature of mythology. The Devry series by Catherine Kerr is, as I understand, one of the best series for Celtic fantasy, and this image is taken from the book and it has a Celtic person mixed with the fantasy part. So we can see history and fantasy here. Firebrand is a retelling of Helen of Troy, which already is a classic tale, and it has been updated to include more fantasy, more magic, more all of that. Steampunk, here we see them in their traditional outfits depending on their era, but we can see the armor and the bolts and the goggles and the guns. Another really good example of steampunk besides these pictures is the movie Wild Wild West with Will Smith, Kenneth Branagh, and Kevin Kline and Salma Hayek. And that is a steampunk western, which definitely shows how steampunk can become fantasy. We have gunpowder fantasy here, which tells the story of this gentleman on the throne who is a soldier, and on top of fighting in the war with, the musket and the technology of the time, he also has to fight gods and creatures who have come out. And then medieval fantasy, the best example of medieval fantasy is, of course, King Arthur. So the top image, we have King Arthur with the Lady of the Lake handing him the Excalibur, and we have Merlin in the background. So it's a legend, but as it has continued to grow, it has definitely turned more into historical fantasy. Here are 3 trilogies from my personal experience, which definitely fit into a more modern historical fantasy genre. We have the Warriors Trilogy by N.M. Brown, and it deals with time travel, magic, war, class, gender, and power. And it's 2 students, Ursula and Dan, who are from the year 2000 and who are sent back to 75 AD. And so it's there they must really rely on themselves and kind of these powers that are coming to them, and, social class and war and just a lot of things they haven't dealt with. We have the next series, which doesn't have a name. I've just called it the Cecilia and Kate Letters because that's how the story is told, by Cecilia and Kate, who are cousins. Cecilia has gone to London to debut herself for her coming out party, while Kate is back where they live. And magic is pretty typical here, so it's 1817 where people know about magic. There's a school for magic. It's not odd, it's not different. So these 2 cousins are dealing with this, as well as society and getting married and meeting boys and everything like that. The last series is the Gemma Doyle series, which is one of my favorite trilogies, and it follows a young girl. She's 16. Her name's Gemma Doyle. And Gemma Doyle series, we can definitely see the two hands of historical fantasy, because Gemma Doyle is now living in London, where after growing up in India, and she has to deal with this patriarchal society, which is really putting her down, and she doesn't understand it, and she's trying so hard to navigate the path that they have put upon her. And at the same time, she's dealing with magic, with visions, and this mysterious and magical place called the Realms, and two ancient orders that are really pressuring her as the last one who can get into this place. So it's definitely a very good combination of history and fantasy and putting them together. So these three trilogies are definitely more modern takes on the other genres in historical fiction and historical fantasy and how it has come to be. And that's my presentation. Thank you for listening to me. If you haven't seen Wild Wild West and you would like to see an example of steampunk, I did include the YouTube link for the trailer, so you're more than welcome to see that. Thank you very much.